Hi, everyone. We're just going to wait a minute here as everyone's trickling in, and then we'll get started. Okay, so we'll get started. Welcome to iNaturalist CSI, the second in our iNaturalist series to help with targeting and identifying certain species groups. This one focusing on aquatics. So our first one with invasives was insects, and then we've got one coming up on invasive plants on August 30th. And then in September, end of September, we'll have one on common birds as well. This webinar and others we've delivered are recorded and can be found on CWF's website as well as our YouTube channel. The easiest way to find these is to just Google CWF webinars. I would like to begin by acknowledging with gratitude that the land from which the Canadian Wildlife Federation resides and where we live, work, and play is the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. I'm Caitlin Brandt, and I'm the digital iNaturalist technician at the Canadian Wildlife Federation. And we have here today as our presenter, Gabby Nichols, programs coordinator at the Canadian Council on Invasive Species. So I'm just going to do a really quick intro on iNaturalist, and then I will hand it over to Gabby. So just some housekeeping. If you're having problems with audio, check the audio settings on Zoom and make sure your headphones and speakers are connected. Another thing that I find works is just by leaving the webinar and re-entering usually helps. The chat we use for technical difficulties. So if you're having issues with audio, write it in the chat. Only panelists, so me and Gabby, can see that. And for questions, we use the Q&A feature. So you should see a Q&A at the bottom of your screen. Type in any questions as we go, and we'll try and get to them all at the end. A background on the Canadian Wildlife Federation. CWF is one of Canada's largest conservation organizations, undertaking projects and conservation across the country. Our mission is to conserve and inspire the conservation of Canada's wildlife and habitats. We do this in a number of ways. We have specific projects in freshwater, marine, and terrestrial environments. We have many that target species at risk, which we're going to talk a little bit about in some of the other webinars, like the right whale, Blanding's turtle, at-risk bats, and the monarch butterfly. We also have public and youth education programs like Wild Outside for 15 to 18-year-olds, the Canadian Conservation Corps for 18 to 30-year-olds, and in community science like iNaturalist. So iNaturalist is managed in Canada by the Canadian Wildlife Federation, and these other organizations and the CWF make up our Canadian steering committee. So we have the Royal Ontario Museum, Canada Parks, and NatureServe Canada. There are 19 countries that have iNaturalist so far. There's more in the works. So we've got Canada, the iNaturalist.org is American, and that is the original. And then every country that comes into it adds into their own language. For example, iNaturalist.ca is in English and French. And all of our resources are too. There's a lot of observations all over the world. This is a map of the observations across the world. The darker it is, the more density. It all feeds into the iNaturalist.org database, which is run by the California Academy of Sciences, along with Nat Geo. There's over 100 million observations globally. Canada has over 8 million. We're trying to hit 10 million by the end of the summer, so make sure you get iNetting. The data is searchable and downloadable by anyone. Obscured species in Canada, which are any species that are at risk of poaching or collection, are shared with conservation organizations as well, so they can help protect them. A primary reason we're encouraging people to use iNaturalist Canada is it allows data to be shared more easily for conservation purposes. So you can actually switch which country you're linked to in your account settings. So some of them automatically go to .org, so you can always check and change it to Canada. The content is catered to local species and helps you connect with other Canadians. And like I said, it is in English and French on the Canadian one. So there's the stats. So for introduced species, which we're going to be talking about today, you can actually search for introduced species on iNaturalist. So if you go to iNaturalist and the Explore tab, there's a filters button in orange. You can click on that. And from there, you can click introduced. Verifiable means that it has a photo, sound recording, location, dates, and that's just to make sure we know what we saw. So the main takeaway from iNaturalist is you don't need to be an expert to help with conservation. You know, we have an app and a website, whatever you prefer to upload photos on your phone, you can take the picture directly in the app, and on the website, you can drag and drop photos right onto the website. The better the photo is, the more in focus it is, the more likely it's going to be ID'd. And we've created a bunch of resources on iNaturalist.ca in the help section to help with specific species groups and how to photograph them. So yes, that's all from me, I believe. Oh, there's over 250,000 people who help identify on the website around the world. So lots of people to help. There's an image recognition software, which is here. So it will tell you, what it thinks it is. And it is really, really good. So recommend you use that if you don't know what's in the photo. And there's some examples of our guides. So definitely take a look, and Gabby will tell us a lot more about how to identify aquatics. And with that, I will hand it over to her.
Thanks so much, Caitlin. Just gonna share my screen. Hopefully you can see that. Please let me know if not. All right, well, thank you so much, Caitlin, for having me today to present. I'm really excited to be here. As Caitlin mentioned, I'm Gabby Nichols. I'm the Programs Coordinator at the Canadian Council on Invasive Species. And I'm here to talk about the 10 invasive aquatic species that we have identified across Canada, just some top 10 ones, definitely not fully inclusive. But very excited to talk about it today. And I join you from Guelph, Ontario, which is the ancestral homeland of the Anishinaabe peoples, specifically the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. So very grateful to be on this land today presenting to you. And just to give a little bit of background on the Canadian Council and who we are. So we're a federally registered nonprofit organization, and we were created as a result of a multi-agency Canada-wide meeting at the National Invasive Species Forum, where a need for a national voice to bring together provincial and territorial perspectives and work on invasive species was identified. So from that, we now consider ourselves the national voice and hub to protect Canada from the impacts of invasive species. And we have a diverse board with 4 main chambers. So we have representation from national government, as well as industry and business related to invasive species, some Indigenous organizations as well, and chapters, which I'll go into detail in a little bit and explain what that is. But yeah, some great diversity in our representation, and together we work together with other partners across Canada to deliver pathway-focused tools and resources through behavior change and other tactics that stimulate Canadians and other people living in Canada to take action on invasive species. So just to look here at some of our board of directors, some of our organizations that help us steer the direction that we're going. You can see that there are some government organizations as well as some local and regional invasive species organizations and other nonprofits. So a lot of different groups coming together to help represent and steer us in our direction. And as mentioned, we do have chapters, so that's a part of our board, but we also have a full chapters network. So our chapters are defined as provincial or territorial, nonprofit or charitable organization. And essentially there's one chapter per province or territory. That's the goal. So each of these groups you see on the screen here represent a province or territory in Canada and represent the sort of voice for that province or territory on the work they do in invasive species. So at this time, we have only 11 chapters. So we're really hoping to get a few more to kind of fully cover Canada and all of its provinces and territories. But right with what we have right now, we're just focusing on further growing it and supporting it. It's been really exciting with our chapters network. We have frequent meetings with them, and just to see the collaboration that goes on is always very exciting. Sharing resources, reducing the duplication of efforts, and sharing information about species ID and tactics to manage invasive species. It's been really cool, and we're just further growing and strengthening this part of our organization. So it's been a big part, and they've also helped select some of the species for this talk today. So a little bit of background on invasive species just before we dive into our species. In Canada, invasive species are one of the 5 direct drivers of biodiversity loss. Or I should say in the world, they're one of 5 direct drivers of biodiversity loss. So that's huge. And there's a big recognition there of how impactful invasive species can be. On an economic side of things, the estimated cumulative costs annually of lost revenue caused by just 16 species, invasive species, is between $13 and $35 billion. So that's each year, which that is absolutely astronomical. So for a definition, an invasive species can essentially be a plant, an animal, a microorganism, which could be a disease or a parasite, that has been accidentally or even deliberately introduced into an area beyond their native range. So that's one piece to the definition. The second piece is that the species that's been introduced beyond its native range has to have a negative impact, and it has to hit one of those 3 categories there. So impacts on the environment or ecosystem, impacts on the economy or industry, and impacts on society, which would include human health. So as you can imagine, invasive species that hit 1 or 2 or even all 3 of those categories, the more, the merrier really. So the more categories that hit, the sort of more impactful these invasive species are. And a lot of them that we're going to talk about today will hit multiple categories. So just some examples of some of the invasive species that are out there that some of the viewers today might be aware of, spongy moth being one of them. I'm based in Ontario, and in the past few years, if anyone's been around sort of the southern Ontario area and even a bit more up north, you may be aware of spongy moth caterpillar, previously called gypsy moth. So this caterpillar basically in the last few years has had some really high numbers. It goes up into the tree canopies of our broadleaf deciduous trees and essentially defoliates the tree by eating it. And the past few years, it's been very high levels. So sometimes you'll walk outside and it almost sounds like rain is dropping because you just hear them munching. And then of course, there's also their feces dropping too. So there actually is something dropping from the sky. So not fun to be outdoors when that's going on, but then also the impact to our trees has been pretty significant. They don't always necessarily kill the tree, but they certainly stress the tree out. And then you add maybe other damages or heat stress to a tree, and it could possibly kill the tree for sure. Another species to look out for is garlic mustard. It's a prolific seed producer. One plant can produce thousands of seeds. And they're really tiny little black seeds. A lot of the time they get stuck in the mud, which then attaches to the bottom of our shoes. So when people kind of walk through new trail areas without cleaning off their boots, it's easy for this species to spread, and you often see it along trails or in any sort of disturbed soil area where seeds can just kind of drop down and quickly sprout up. So it is a biannual. So by the second year, it kind of produces a longer stalk, a white flower, and it can essentially multiply in size in just 4 years. It can it can absolutely expand. So you can see in the picture there, it's sort of in an undercover or understory of a forest, and there's absolutely no room for native species to grow there. So it's really competitive with our native species. Giant hogweed is one that's often in the news. So this is a plant that was originally introduced through the horticulture trade, and its sap, if it gets on your skin and then that is exposed to sunlight, can actually create a sort of burn on your skin. So it's pretty famous in the news for that, and definitely a great example of how it can impact human health. Invasive species can impact human health. So just a few examples there. And I did mention earlier pathways of spread. So what exactly are pathways of spread? So that's sort of the focus of the Canadian Council on Invasive Species. We're looking at human-made pathways typically. However, there are natural pathways that invasive species can spread. So think about water or wind dispersal of seeds or species. That might be a way that species naturally move across a landscape and into new areas. But often when we have humans involved helping to transport those species through different pathways of spread, they go far greater distances, far more frequently. So some great examples of pathways of spread include outdoor recreation on land or water, say camping, hiking, boating, kayaking, swimming, firewood movement, when you're moving your firewood up into a new campsite that might have pests in it that you can't see, gardening and horticulture trade. This trade is actually responsible for about 58% of invasive plants that have been intentionally introduced through the horticulture trade, which is a pretty big number. And then the pet and aquarium trade, a lot of the time when species get too big for their tanks or when people are improperly disposing of tank water, they'll put it out into the natural systems. And unfortunately, a lot of species can spread and become invasive once introduced. So there's going to be a few examples in our talk today about that. Agriculture is another example. And so this list of pathways is definitely not all inclusive. There's a lot of different ones, but these are just examples of some of the pathways that we focused on the most and promote Canadians to prevent the spread through. So just to give you an idea also of new invasions and how frequently they happen, I have a few stats for you. So the number of new invasions by species has increased over the past 200 years, with about 40% occurring in the last 40 years. So definitely in this last chunk of time here, we've seen just an absolute explosion of invasive species moving from areas to areas. People move a lot more, the global trade, people flying from one area to the next, not cleaning gear. There's a lot of different reasons for it, but it just means we have to be that much more vigilant for it. And another fact for you, a new invasive plant is established in Canada every 2 years. So this fact was from 2011, so this might be a little bit higher now, but that's just plants. So it gives you sort of an idea of these pathways and how frequently new species can be introduced if they're not caught. So, and just to wrap up this slide, as we've seen with the garlic mustard example, giant hogweed, and spongy moth, it would have been far better if we had not introduced these species or if we had caught their introductions a lot earlier. So focusing on pathways helps us to be a bit more preventative. Once these species are established, it's often very expensive to try and remove them. It takes a lot of effort, and sometimes it's even just a lost cause. There might not be the right tools available or even worth the cost and time. So way more important to focus on preventing them and closing those pathways rather than trying to deal with it afterwards. So not only pathways are an important focus, but learning to identify and then report these invasive species is a key tool to us preventing and being proactive with invasive species. So when you report invasive species and you learn how to identify them, it helps us to act quickly, kind of have that early detection, even if it's a species that already exists in an area. If it's a new sort of satellite population, it's so important to kind of identify that. It's way easier to control and manage an existing population when you keep it from expanding. So important to report whether it's new, never been seen before, or existing. It's just way better to have more information than none at all. So that'll be a theme as well. And we'll touch back on reporting at the end of the 10 species I'm about to go through. But just before we dive in, I just wanted to say that this list of 10 species, like I said, we reached out to our chapter organization, so provinces and territories across Canada, and asked for what were their species that they are focusing on. So we came up with this list of 10 aquatic invasive species. And some of them are existing and are being managed by our chapters, and some are just sort of on the radar and are threatening Canada, but not yet present. So something to keep in mind there. And yeah, let's see what we've got up next. So to start, zebra and quagga mussels. So this is a pretty big one, and I've identified it as an alert species because it is present in Canada. It's in Ontario, Quebec, and Manitoba, but it's not yet present in other provinces. And even just recently in BC, there was a finding of this zebra mussels, I believe it was, and they were able to be detected and are being managed. So again, important for those early detection moments. So it's an alert species for all other provinces and areas where the species doesn't exist. But yeah, these zebra and quagga mussels, so essentially they're freshwater mussels. They're native to Europe and Asia. They were introduced in the 1980s through ballast water, which is definitely going to be a theme for this webinar and how these species are introduced. But essentially, these mussels are capable of high reproductive rates, but also, unlike our native mussels, have these really strong sort of strings and tendons that can attach to hard and soft surfaces. And essentially, that is the part that makes them just so durable and causes their spread as well. So as you can imagine, anything that's been in the water for a while, it's going to be attached with a zebra mussel or a quagga mussel if those are present. So thinking about boats, docks, break walls, intake water pipes, hydro infrastructure, essentially anything that's hard enough surface for them to grab onto, they will. So really big impacts. And because of that, the economic costs. So some of these numbers are from just Ontario, but as you can imagine, in the other provinces that they're in, there's also been some high costs as well. So the initial cost of zebra mussels control measures for Ontario Hydro were about $20 million and an annual $1 million in operating costs. And that was back in 2004. And again, another number from 2004, the estimated cumulative impact of zebra mussels range from about 3 billion to 7.5 billion in the Great Lakes alone. So just an absolutely huge cost. And that's why we really do not want it in other provinces and territories. So here's a few examples of what zebra mussel infestation might look like if it gets out of hand. You can see the bottom of a boat there, propellers, a shopping cart that was pulled out of some water. It's pretty bad news. So I mentioned the rapid reproduction. One female can produce 1 million eggs per year. So you can imagine just how quickly this would spread and grow. And they can also tolerate a wide range of conditions, of water conditions. They tend to create clearer water. So essentially, they're really great at filtering out phytoplankton, but phytoplankton is also a really important part of our food chain and supports our native aquatic life. So by removing that phytoplankton, you're kind of starving our ecosystems of a lot of essential nutrients. Zebra mussels have also been linked to toxic algal blooms, which can cause habitat loss and fish die-off. They colonize in spawning areas, so covering surfaces, which could be used for fish eggs and fish spawning. So that again is inhibiting the growth and productivity of other native species. Biofouling, as I mentioned, clogging underwater structures, infrastructure, drainage pipes, yeah, very hard to get rid of once we have it. And then they also reduce swimming opportunities. So once the species dies off, those hard shells actually wash up on our shores. So sometimes you will get beaches that are just covered in hard shells, and it is not fun to walk on. You can definitely cut your feet. So not fun at all. And the other piece to consider with this is that they're really great at surviving in a wide range of conditions. And that includes also surviving out of water in the right conditions for about 7 to 30 days. So that's outside of water. So you can imagine you take your boat, you take your waders out, anything out of the water that has been in contact with water that has zebra mussels in it. And you need to make sure that it's cleaned, drained, and dried so that you're not spreading any species. The other piece to this is that the juvenile zebra mussels and quagga mussels are actually microscopic. You can't actually see them with the human eye. So even though you think something might be clean when you take it out of the water, a lot of the time it could potentially be carrying something. So again, just so important to be clean, draining, and drying anything that touches the water before moving on to another body of water. And as far as identification, they can have a variety of different sort of striping, but you often do see the striping. Sometimes it's a bit more obvious than others. They're similar in size. So zebra mussels are about 3.5 centimeters long, whereas quagga mussels are about 4 centimeters long. They both have a flat edge, which gives them a sort of D shape. And they both have dark banding as mentioned. So they also, one way to tell is if you actually set them up, they won't fall over, which a native mussel doesn't have that sort of flat surface to sit on. And they're also distinguished from native mussels by, as I mentioned, not having those strong threads that grip onto hard and soft surfaces. So definitely something to look out for. So Eurasian water milfoil, this is another pretty bad one that we have in some areas of Canada. So this species, this is a plant that was introduced from Europe, Asia, and Northern Africa. So it was likely introduced in about the 1800s, again from ballast water release. So currently this species is in BC, New Brunswick, Quebec, and Ontario. It's very fast growing, has a very high dispersal rate, which makes it so invasive. It can grow very quickly in any water to about 10 meters in size. It produces seeds, but also can spread through fragmentation. So essentially, you can take one piece of that plant and that small piece can create a whole new plant. So you can imagine how this problem can get bad pretty quickly. Imagine sticking a propeller in there, not washing that propeller off and moving to a new area. It can very quickly spread this plant. So as you can see from these pictures, it forms these really dense mats that can actually shade out aquatic plants underneath, causing die-off and causing lower oxygen levels, which then affects the entire aquatic community as well. It can cause fish kills, and then it also is not something that you want to be swimming in. It can get really tangled when you try swimming. Propellers can get stuck in it, and then you can just further spread it from there, as mentioned. And just some ID, it's one of those kind of trickier plants to ID, and it looks very similar to our native northern milfoil. So you can see on the left, there is the native northern milfoil on the far left, and then you have the Eurasian water milfoil to the right. There's a few more leaflets on that stem, so that's one way to tell. And you can see in the picture on the right, it definitely is a bit more of a dense look. It also can have a bit more of a red color at the tip of it. And if you sort of look at the stem from a sort of like a bird's eye view, it essentially has 4 whorls around the stem, like it's showing in that right picture. And just again, another comparison to the native milfoil, you can see the foliage is just a little bit more dense. There's a bit more leaflet material there. And again, looking at that bit more of a reddish color to it. So smallmouth bass. So this one we've identified as an alert species as well. This is a bit of a tricky one because in some parts of Canada, it is actually a native species. So more of the southern Ontario area, it's considered in our Great Lakes and St. Lawrence system, a native species. So it's a freshwater fish. It's considered just in the sunfish family. and also a very aggressive and predatory fish. It can eat a wide range of different species and also tends to live in habitats where other predators aren't. So it sort of makes itself the top predator, and also creates a situation where there really isn't much that will eat it. So essentially it is invasive in southern BC, southeast Saskatchewan, like Winnipeg and Manitoba, northern lakes in Ontario up into the Timmins area, southern Quebec, south and west New Brunswick, and southern Nova Scotia. So it's got quite a wide range, and that's because it was actually introduced as a sport fish. It's a fairly popular sport fish, and up into the early 1900s, it was introduced across Canada into different lakes. And even today, there are some lakes where it's considered a sport fish and it is legal for it to be there. But it's very important to know the legislation and the lake in which you are on, because the movement of this fish and release into new water bodies or using it as bait is not permitted. So being very aware of what's in your area and what's permitted is an important piece to this for any anglers out there. But yes, as mentioned, a really popular sport fish, but unfortunately very aggressive to our native species and very successful as well. So just to a quick idea of this species, I'm by no means a fish expert, but I guess one of the quick and easy ways to tell what this species, or to tell this species from others, is you'll notice that the jawline does not extend beyond that eye where that line is sort of there. So it's got sort of a very short jawline. Another identification feature are those dark lines that you see kind of coming away from the eye. The fish itself can have a few different colors, but depending on the size, the condition, and habitat, it will be darker with pronounced contrasting markings in clear water and lighter with blurry markings in cloudier water. So it can kind of appear different depending on the type of water. So definitely something to keep an eye out for and be aware of legislation in your area, and to, of course, never move or use this species as live bait. So flowering rush. So this is a aquatic plant species native to Europe and Western Asia, first discovered in North America and the St. Lawrence area, and it's into the Great Lakes region as well. So it's been here for a while, again, introduced through the ballast water, and it was commonly imported and sold through the water garden trade. You can see just by looking at the flowers, they're very pretty. So you can imagine that it would be a popular backyard pond plant. And then from there has sort of either through illegal dumping of the species into waterways, or even storm events can cause fragments of these species to move from ponds and into natural waterways and have it sort of spread from there. So this one's been here in Canada, North America for a while, and it's found in all of our provinces. So definitely a big issue, but also fairly common. So something to keep an eye out for. It's very quick to reproduce and sort of take over an aquatic area. It can change the way water flows through an area and also outcompete native aquatic plants. So it impedes the use of shallow water for your recreation, for irrigation, and for industrial activities, and alters natural ecosystems. So yeah, not a great one. Definitely has a lot of impacts on biodiversity and altering fish and wildlife habitat. Looking at the roots, you can see that there is, it's hard to see, I guess, from the root, but essentially two key ways to identify it is to take a sort of cross section of the leaves of the roots, and it has a sort of triangular shape to it. So that's something to look for. The stems can be about 1 to 1.5 meters tall, and then the flowers themselves are sort of that pretty pink color that we saw in the previous photo. They have apparently an almond scent to them, and they're in an umbrella shape. So that's something to look for when you're out. And the species is unfortunately really great. It can also be really great at spreading. It can be found in both shallow waters, but in more deep waters up to 6 meters in depth. It doesn't always produce flowers, but most often you would see it. The shallower the water, the more likely it is to produce the flowers. So here's another one that's been in Canada for some time. So European green crab is one of the 100 worst invasive alien species as listed by the World Conservation Union back in 2004. I think it's probably still up there on the list, even though some time has passed. So it's a small coastal crustacean native to Europe and Northern Africa. So it arrived again on ships, likely in the wooden cargo holds of ships. And populations have been found in the Pacific and Atlantic coast of BC. So there was actually a few different accounts of these populations being introduced, and they are slightly different. So the first population was introduced into Atlantic Canada in the 1950s. Then a second population in the 1980s and 90s was introduced to Nova Scotia, and that population is more cold tolerant. And apparently those two populations have actually hybridized, making a cold tolerant population that's also spreading sort of north and south on the Atlantic coast. So definitely a nasty one to look out for. And then recently in 2018, there have been populations found out on the BC side of things. So that's something to keep an eye out for. I know there's a lot of people getting creative about ways to solve the problem of this crab. Using its shell to create bioplastics is something I've seen. So people are definitely getting creative, but it's a pretty bad issue that we definitely don't want to support its spread. So important again to be aware of what the species is and not to spread it to other areas. Ways to identify it, it can look fairly similar to our native crab species. So it's also not always green. It can be sort of like a brown and yellowy color as well. Very resilient, is very aggressive and territorial as well, and feeds on a lot of different species. They can be up to about 10 centimeters in length, and the shell is sort of serrated in a bit of a pentagon shape. It has sharp spines on either side of its eye, so that's something to look for. Its claws are actually different sizes, and then its back leg tips are both hairy and have sort of a pointed and flattened look to them. So those are a few things to look for if you are in a coastal area with crabs. Otherwise, this may not be something of concern in the sort of Great Lakes or interior regions. So domestic goldfish. So this is, to some people, they may not realize that this is an invasive species, but it certainly is. As you're probably aware, it's a common pet species. It's actually been a pet for, I think, about 2,000 years was what I was seeing there. Originally from ancient China, this pet is related to carp species and was found to have sort of different variations in colors. It's also been seen to be a sort of lucky fish. So there's a lot of reasons that this species has continued to be a pet time and time again. It's also incredibly hardy and able to withstand a lot of different conditions and as well as poor conditions. So when introduced into the environment, say when the species gets too big or someone doesn't want to take care of it anymore, it can be released into local ponds and waterways and can quickly spread from there. So they can tolerate low oxygen conditions, water temperatures of quite a variety between 0 and 41 degrees Celsius. They feed on a variety of different species. They also are known to reduce water quality. They could also spread disease. So definitely not worth releasing into the environment and harming our native species. They're really great at at surviving in some pretty bad conditions. So when they do kind of create those darker water conditions, it often doesn't allow sunlight to reach our native aquatic plants, can then cause die-off of those plants and make the water body not suitable for all of our native species. So that's kind of a way that goldfish impact our native wildlife. And a few ways to identify them. So obviously they can be very orange, but they can also have a few different looks. So the top right photo you can see is a bit of a mottled look. And then the bottom left you can see is a bit more of a silver look. So they are related to carp. and they can actually breed with other species, which is why they can get a sort of more silvery look to them. But one way to identify them is that their head often has no scales, and then you'll see that dorsal fin, which is the top fin, is very long and usually is longer than the actual length of the head. So that's something to look for to identify when compared to other things or other fish species. So they usually can get to be about 15 to 20 centimeters long. They do grow larger in larger areas. So when you put it into a pond, it's going to get a lot bigger than it was in just a tank. The largest goldfish reported was about 59 centimeters long and weighed 3 kilograms. So they can get quite large. So marbled crayfish. So this is actually a really interesting species and another pet species introduced through the pet trade. So another one to look out for those who are aquarium lovers. We definitely don't want this spreading into Canada. So there's actually no known native populations of the species, and that's because it was believed to be created in about, I think it was the 1995 mark. It was created by breeding different crayfish species together. And as you can see, it can have a sort of blue tinge to it, but has this really interesting mottled look, which makes it a desirable pet species or aquarium species because it has such a unique look. But essentially this species has been introduced into the wild in Europe, and they're seeing it as a species that can tolerate a wide range of conditions as well. So it can live in rivers, lakes, swamps, ditches, ponds, and can outcompete there's a fear that it can outcompete the native crayfish species, consume a lot of vegetation. It can consume vegetation and reduce habitat for fish and other aquatic species. So essentially degrading the aquatic system like a lot of the other species we've talked about. So this is certainly one that we don't want released into Canada. So this is something to keep an eye out for, and definitely be aware of the aquariums and how you dispose of the water. Making sure you're disposing of it properly is a big way that we can prevent the spread. So not yet reported in Canada, and we're hoping to keep it that way. As far as identification, it is similar in size to some of our native crayfish species. So it can be about 13 centimeters long. The claws actually tend to be a little bit smaller than our native species, and the colors aren't always it's not always the blue that we see in this photo, but it can be quite a variety of olive or dark brown to tan to reddish and to blue. So color might not be the most reliable feature to kind of focus on for identification, but definitely keep an eye out for this one and never release it. Oh, and I should mention as well, not just through the pet trade, but crayfish are typically used as live bait species as well. So being aware of the bait species you have or not using live bait is another option for preventing the spread. So this is another really key invasive species, and it unfortunately isn't probably something that you can photograph because it's a disease and take and put on iNaturalist, but it was something that recognized by our chapters as an important species to identify. So Whirling Disease is currently in Alberta and in some of the watersheds there. It was first found in Banff National Park in 2016. It's originally from Europe, where it's actually native, but it was believed to be introduced in the Pennsylvania area. Its first introduction to North America in Pennsylvania in about the 1950s. So I don't think there's full confirmation on how it landed in Banff National Park. It could possibly have been through the food trade, but it's a pretty nasty parasite. Essentially, it's a parasite related to jellyfish, anemones, hydra, and corals. It infects salmonid fish species as its final host. So salmonid species tend to be very important for socioeconomic, so fisheries, but also tourism, recreation and angling are all, they're kind of a top focus species for those pathways. So in the States, they've seen up to 90% mortality in fish species where the parasite is present. So definitely a really nasty one. It has a bit of a complicated life cycle as well. Essentially, this microscopic parasite has spores that live in the sediment underwater. Those spores then get into aquatic worms. Those worms then through their feces and through the next sort of life stage of the parasite, get into the gills and to the skin of fish, and they actually affect the cartilage of the fish. So they consume the cartilage, which is where you can get deformities in sort of smaller fish. It can affect adult fish as well, but younger and more juvenile fish tend to be impacted a little bit more. So you'll see deformations of the head, the tail, and the photo we have here. You can see that the tail itself is sort of crooked. There's a blackening of the tail. And also you may notice fish that have contracted this swim in a sort of cyclone pattern. They do like a little spin around. So those are all sort of symptoms to look for. But essentially, yeah, so this parasite gets into the fish, infects the fish may die, or the spores itself may be released from the fish and contaminate the rest of the water and other fish in the area. If the fish washes up on shore, a bird may eat it, and it can also spread through the bird's feces. So essentially, once it's in the water, very difficult to get rid of. There's no sort of control or solution known yet. So the best we can do at this point is prevent it. And the best we can do on the prevention side of things is to clean, drain, dry any equipment, anything that touches the water. This is microscopic again, so we can't see it. So it's so important to be cleaning, draining, and drying all of your gear before moving to new water bodies. So really important, and I've just put there on the screen a couple of links if you want to learn more or even report sightings of this. Just so important that it doesn't spread any further. Okay, so just in terms of time, I've kind of combined the last 3 and a bonus extra 11th species on this page here. So essentially, these ones were also identified by our chapters, but not as high on the list as some of the earlier ones, but just as important, I'm sure. So cord grasses, this is a species that affects our Pacific Northwest and in North America. So it is present in BC. There are 3 different species. So their common names are English cordgrass, dense flowered cordgrass, and salt meadow cordgrass. There is a native species of cordgrass on the east coast of Canada that has been seen to be invasive on the Pacific coast in the US, but has not yet reached BC. So that's good news. But again, another example of a species that is native in one area and not in another of Canada. So cordgrasses, also known as Spartina, they've been planted by humans. They're often planted to create sort of a farming situation, supply fodder for livestock, and to prevent erosion. But unfortunately, they're very good at this. And a lot of the time, once they're introduced, they can really, the cordgrasses can decrease habitat for shorebird, waterfowl, fish, and shellfish. They eliminate grounds for nursery and juvenile fish. They sort of change the water flow, how water kind of moves through, and the hydrology of aquatic systems. They impact coastal-based industries like shellfish growers, fisheries, and tourism. They disrupt ecological structures, for example, the function of mudflats and salt marshes. So there's just a whole slew of impacts from this species because it is just so good at growing and taking up water and space. So definitely one to look for, especially if you're on the West Coast. So top right, you can see Prussian Carp, and you might notice that this actually looks a little bit similar to that non-orange goldfish picture that we showed earlier, and that's because carp and goldfish are related. So it looks very similar. It's also sort of a smaller fish and is similar to goldfish in the fact that it can tolerate a wide variety of conditions as well. So it's this sort of silvery brown body fish. It closely resembles goldfish. It can live about 5 to 10 years, but spawns several times a year. So very successful through reproduction. Right now, it's only present in Alberta and Saskatchewan. So if you're in those areas, be aware of not moving the species or using it as bait. And perhaps keeping an eye out too when you're out on the water and identifying and reporting any that you see. So they are habitat generalists and they outcompete native species. They're often found in areas where native species could never survive. So thinking about a ditch with some pretty stagnant water, you might actually find some Prussian carp in there. So really, really versatile species that's really great at living in our waters. So something to keep an eye out there for too. And again, cleaning, draining, and drying can help prevent the movement of this species as well. And finally, we have New Zealand mud snails. So as the name suggests, they are native to New Zealand and surrounding islands. And this species is just absolutely fabulous at hitchhiking through ballast water or through attaching itself to aquatic equipment. It's basically spread around the globe. It was introduced to North America around 1987, they believe, and it's in Australia now, Europe, and Asia. So it's very well spread. It's absolutely an amazing has amazing reproduction, I guess. So one single female can form a colony of 40 million snails. So it really doesn't take long for this species to just take over. It can be found in waterways, including lakes, rivers, and streams. It's extremely resilient, especially when establishing in a foreign environment and sort of outcompeting the native species that live there. So with its high reproductive rate and then its ability to consume food available, it's very great at outcompeting native species. It's actually been found when native fish do eat it, they tend to actually lose weight because the snail can survive the digestive tract and will actually continue to eat while it's in the fish's digestive tract. So very, very resilient species and definitely one we want to be aware of. So yeah, they threaten biodiversity, disrupt the food chain, reduce the growth capacity of population sizes for native aquatic species. And again, how we can prevent it is with that clean, drain, drying, making sure all your gear is clean before you're moving to the next body of water. So definitely a big one to leave off on there. So we've gone through, we've identified some major invasive species. That's for sure not all of the aquatic invasive species in Canada. There's a ton out there for you to be aware of. So this is just a great start. And we definitely encourage you to take pictures and report. And even if you're not sure that it's an invasive species, we still want you to take pictures and report it because you don't know what you're getting and taking a picture of, and somebody will be able to identify it and you might be able to stop a big invasion before it happens. So always reporting is so important. In terms of tips for actually taking pictures that make it more identifiable, I know Caitlin had mentioned some resources that iNaturalist has, but it always helps to kind of, making sure it's in focus, using zoom capabilities, making sure the background is kind of clear so we can identify what's the species versus the background. And I have a couple of example pictures here taken from the previous slides. So you can see in the flowering rush photo on the left, that background is blurred. It's really clear to see what the full flower head looks like. Another step for if you're going to take more photos might be to get just one single flower as well. Take a photo of that, maybe taking a picture of what the leaf looks like. All of these kind of help. On the right, you see the Eurasian water milfoil that we talked about. It's really helpful with a species like that can get so matted and created in these sort of stagnant, dark waters to, if you can, put something behind it. In this case, it's someone's hand, just so that we can see what the species look like and we can kind of see those leaflets and even potentially count those leaflets. So any information, any way that you can really sort of make it clear what those identifiable features look like when you report, that all really helps. So definitely do follow those. And then I'll just go back so that you can see we have a couple options for reporting. So you can visit our website for options to report to your provinces or territories. So go to reportcanadainvasives.ca and you can see a breakdown of reporting links or reporting information by each province. But we also have a iNaturalist project with iSpy and it's called iSpy and Identify Invasives. So we really encourage you to go on there and report any species you see. It really helps us to identify early establishments of species. So please report. We really appreciate it. And if you're interested in learning more about chapter resources, you can visit the link there on the website. That leads to our chapters page, and you can find species-specific information through our chapters that are relevant to your area. And just before we go, I just wanted to mention again those take actions. So it's not just reporting, it's also making sure you're doing what you can to prevent the spread and close those pathways. So wherever you go, whatever you're doing, usually there's something you can do to prevent the spread. So you can see our different take action programs there on the screen, and also the website links are there for you to learn more if you're interested. And each page has a pledge form, and we really encourage everyone to take the pledge. It helps you remind you of your commitment and helps increase the chances that the next time you're outdoors, hiking, biking, on the water, or planting in your garden, that you'll think about invasive species and you'll take actions to prevent the spread. So definitely check out those pages. And I'm happy to take any questions. Thanks so much.
Great, thank you so much, Gabby. I definitely learned a lot. Seen a green crab in my time in Hogweed. Learned a lot about them.
They sound like nasty little guys, but I haven't seen one myself. But yeah, always cool to see something in real life.
Great. So thank you again for being here, and thank you to everyone who attended. We do have some questions. We've got a little bit of time. So I was wondering, Gabby, are there any primary control strategies being used for zebra mussels, or is the main focus just preventing their spread into further water bodies?
Yeah, so I'm not going to pretend that I'm an expert in zebra mussels specifically. I know that there are some control strategies, but I think in terms of protecting water bodies that don't yet have them, prevention is the #1 tool. And I know a lot of those control sort of prevention strategies are taking water samples, using eDNA to see if there are zebra mussels in the area, and sampling for the sort of the veligers, which are those juvenile zebra mussels. So as far as management when they are established, I don't have a ton of information. I know there are methods being used in the Great Lakes region, but yeah, prevention is definitely like our #1 strategy. And I believe it's in possibly Manitoba, Saskatchewan, along the border there. There are officers, conservation officers that inspect boats to make sure they've been clean, drained, dried. And I know, even I've seen in the news, it's always exciting. They've actually trained dogs to sniff out zebra mussels on boats too. So there are some really cool techniques being used to try and prevent, because it's just so essential that these don't get introduced. So yeah, great question.
Wow, that's really interesting. Oh, I love that. Humans and dogs working together.
Yeah, it always helps, right?
So someone else asked, what is the best way to dispose of a dead pet fish, a goldfish, that kind of thing?
Definitely. Okay, so yeah, I guess if it's dead, that's another thing. So a lot of the time when the species is already dead, we suggest that you freeze it for a while. That can help kind of get rid of any sort of disease it might have, but it's also good to just bury it in the ground, or Ziploc it and throw it into your landfill. even when it's dead, it's just not worth the potential of it sharing diseases or spreading diseases to other aquatic species. So they should never be thrown out. The water it was in should never be thrown out into what a natural water body. So yeah, hopefully that helps.
No, that's really useful information. Thank you. We do have a question about iNaturalist that I can take. It's about increasing public engagement with iNaturalist projects. So on the help section of iNaturalist, there's a whole managing projects section. And then in there, it has a huge guide on how to engage the public with iNaturalist projects. Just some things, definitely use your social media reach, newsletters, how you get out any in-person events. You can also use for an iNaturalist project to get people to sign up. And you can also contact the CWF and we can help with that as well as we manage the website. So I hope that helps.
I can add that to that too, just in terms of some of the resources that we've created through some of our Clean Drain Dry or Play Clean Go projects, adding a QR code that links to a project that makes it just easy for people when they're out and about and they see a sign or whatever resource it is, they can easily scan it and go to that project as well. So I find kind of making it easy for people always helps as well.
Yes, that's perfect. Thank you. We have a few other questions. I was wondering if you knew, how long does the Eurasian milfoil we talked about survive out of water? Or is there a resource where someone can find this out?
Yeah, that's a great question. Unfortunately, I don't know the exact answer to that. Just because I'm based in Ontario, I'm not sure where this person is based in, but I'm fairly certain that the Ontario Invasive Plant Council has some resources on Eurasian water milfoil. So if you go to their website, Ontario Invasive Plant Council is the name. Go to the resource tab. They often have best management practices for aquatic invasive species or the specific species itself. And they usually have a lot of great information on that and on control methods.
Great, thank you. It's 1 p.m. now in Ontario. So I'll leave it on one more question before we go. And after this webinar is over, we're going to take the time to answer some questions and send them out to everybody who attended. So someone has asked, if we positively identify an invasive species, are there any actions we should take?
Yeah, so if you've positively had an identification, definitely reporting it is a key one. For aquatic invasive species, it helps to report it anywhere. I know that iNaturalist, our government agencies, often pull data from there as well to help with reporting. So the Department of Fisheries and Oceans might be another place to check out to see if they have a specific reporting link for the species you've identified. But they'll often be the ones taking the key actions, but reporting it anywhere really just helps. And it's sort of, I think in the background, that's sort of where we then go in and say, okay, what's the next mode of action? So on the citizen science end of things, it's definitely just getting that report out there that helps the most. So thank you.
Great. And thank you again, Gabby, for the awesome presentation. And thank you everybody who came, who asked questions. Like I said, we're going to go through these questions and get answers to all of you. So thank you again, and everyone enjoy your afternoon.
Thanks so much, Caitlin.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.